You're listening to Bookmarked, a young adult book podcast brought to you by Bookstacked.com. This is episode 41, and today we're talking with author Rosaria Munda about her brand new book, Flamefall. There's lots of dragon talk, so stay with us.
Everyone, and welcome to the Bookmark Podcast. My name is Chelsea Regan, and I'm a feature writer at Bookstacked. Today, I am so excited to be talking to Rosaria Munda about the sequel to her 2019 young adult novel, Fireborn. The next book in her trilogy comes out on March 23rd. It's called Flamefall, and to say that I could not put this book down would be a major understatement. I am so thrilled to speak with her and to talk about this book today. So let's get started. Hey, Rosario, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here.
I am so pumped to talk about your book. So I was hoping we could start off for our listeners who haven't read Fireborn or read it a while ago, if you could give them just a quick overall idea of the story and sort of the main characters.
Sure. So Fireborn is about two orphans in a post-revolutionary world who ride dragons, and they're childhood friends despite coming from vastly different backgrounds. And in a way, Fireborn is about them kind of grappling with these differences for the first time. So Lee was born a dragon lord's son, which meant that before the revolution, he was sort of set to rule because his family had dragons. And then they were brutally murdered in the revolution. He lost everything, but he sort of survived Anastasia style. Annie, on the other hand, was born a serf, and she grew up fearing dragons, specifically Lee's father's dragon. And now, because of the revolution, she has a chance to climb and change her station. And they both become friends in an orphanage, not really understanding that they have this shared family history, but then now, as teenagers, they're beginning to work through it. They tested into a dragon riding program, and they're competing with each other for the top spot in the corps. And there's a threat of war from Lee's surviving family, which he's only now realizing exists. So he has to choose what side he'll be on. And Annie has to decide whether or not she can even trust him. And she's sort of coming into her own, stepping into the shoes of a leader at the same time. And so then book two, Flamefall, is about the fallout from their decisions as the war begins.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think you touched on it. You've created this really interesting post-revolutionary world, very original and high fantasy idea with these dragons and this world that is different than ours. But you've used some really specific references to the Roman Empire and that culture. I was wondering sort of what gave you the idea or the inspiration to combine these classic ideas and epics with dragons and fantasy.
I think it was mostly just things happening at the same time when I was a student. So I think the sort of kernel of the idea of Fireborn really came into its own when I was a freshman in college. And at that time, I was an intended classics major. I ended up switching later to political theory. I've been taking Latin and Greek in high school, and I was in an intro to Greek political theory class at the same time as I think How to Train Your Dragons had just come out, and then I think reading Game of Thrones. There were a lot of dragons in the air at the same time. And so I just remember reading Plato's Republic, and I just became obsessed with this idea of Plato's Republic with dragons. So basically there's this conceit in Plato's Republic that, what if we made a world where you select rulers as children and then you raise them to be good, and then they become virtuous rulers, and they're sometimes called the guardians, and they're sometimes called philosopher kings. And I was just this is a terrible idea. Who would ever do this? And the idea, I thought it would be an interesting way to combine with the trope of dragons choosing the rider, which is a common sort of fantasy trope that you see, especially with hatchlings and young riders. And so if you had a world where you had dragons as sort of the main weapon of mass destruction, would it make sense to maybe set up a sort of Plato-style guardian system, meritocratic system to test your children before you pair them with dragons? And that was kind of where the original idea came from. So I do think of it as a very sort of Greek-inspired story, because of the Plato, but then some of the trappings of the way the world is set up with the names Aurelian, it sort of has a Roman Empire feel to it, I think, because that felt a little more familiar. And so yeah, so it was kind of a unholy union of Greek culture and Roman culture, but plus dragons.
Yeah. And it creates a sort of really interesting, full, original world on its own with the dragons, which is always the best. And I love the trope of like the dragon choosing the rider, and then I think you've done a really good job in your books too of the dragon chooses the rider, and then the dragon really does become a weapon for that rider. It becomes however the rider decides to use that tool that they have. I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about the dragons, because I love the way you've sort of created them in your book. And I specifically like that you have different, I want to say like breeds, maybe like types of dragons. There are 3 sort of main ones and some other options we hear about. But I wanted to know like where the inspiration or the idea for your specific types of dragons in these books, because they feel very original and specific.
Oh, thank you. I'm trying to remember. It's weird because that was one of the sort of earliest world building elements. So it's like sometimes you can't remember how you come up with the stuff that started really early. I know originally, like originally they were airplanes. That was very originally. That was sort of before Plato, before freshman year of college, and then they did become dragons. And then I want to say like the names of the breeds sort of, I don't exactly remember how they came about. Like I wanted to have one that sounded Roman, like for a sort of conquering breed of dragon that came in that was not like indigenous to the region, and then have these sort of more like what's the word, like I think there's like the Old English, like kenning is like the word for when you put 2 words together, and sort of have this more like Anglo feeling native breeds like the storm scourge dragons and the skyfish dragons, and then have them sort of together have these 3 families that had different sort of areas that they ruled but were equal but together like balanced. That was kind of the political idea. And I think in terms of the military, I was dating a fencer at the time. I went on to marry that fencer, but also he had 2 sisters who were also fencers, and we were all in college together. So I was hearing about the fencing team a lot, and fencing they have 3 weapons. They have épée, foil, and saber, and then they would talk about the team in terms of the squads, like, oh, he's on saber squad or whatever. And my husband and sisters-in-law are all saberists. And actually one of them is going on to the Olympics. Eliza Stone will probably be in the Olympics this summer, so keep an eye out for her. Anyway, so I just felt like it was interesting hearing them talk about these 3 squads and like different sort of personalities of the squads, and like the way, you know, you had sort of different body types that would try to go well with different weapons and styles. And so I liked the idea of having these slightly different groups of dragons in that way. I think that's where the original sort of like 3 squadrons came from. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something else that I really like about the way you've developed the dragons is it allows for the strategy elements of the fights to feel more like military action and more like it makes sense for these dragons to do this activity rather than just we'll send some over there and some will stay here. It's like, no, this is more specific than that.
Right.
The different types of dragons really lend itself to that well.
Yeah, I thought that was fun, and also sort of like an interesting like political military extension of kind of the idea of like, I don't know, like Hogwarts house, like choosing your personality, because there's like, you know, the idea that these dragons, they have slightly different personalities too, and like, you know, and you could have this element of where Lee sort of basically betrays his home, like his ancestral dragons by like being chosen by a different breed. So I liked having that kind of flexibility and then have it extend in a military way. Exactly.
Yeah, and it does really inform the character as well too when you realize sort of which dragon they've ended up sort of being paired up with and what that might say and what it might mean politically and socially in the world that they've created in sort of both communities and the dangers of that, which kind of brings us to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was some of my favorite characters. Your world is very well populated. There are many characters who I feel very attached to in these books. But I do have to say, I do have a preference. My favorite is definitely Annie. It's probably not a competition. I love her so much. And I love her development. And I love that we have, especially in Fireborn, this strong, capable woman who's had these difficult situations and been through this trauma, but is doing her best to come out of it, but also has insecurity and is dealing with that insecurity. And it's not always easy or perfect. Like she can't always just like overcome it's something that she continues to struggle with. And then I think in Flamefall, it was really nice to see her come into this leadership position and find that. And so I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about both creating that character in Fireborn and continuing her journey into Flamefall.
Yeah, I love what you say about her having weaknesses, because I think we're sort of entering into a period where people are sort of like making the idea of a strong female character a bit more complicated, which I like. I don't know, because growing up, I always really appreciated like alternate female heroines like Hermione, who's just like, she's so smart, but she cracks under pressure. You know, like I always felt like I could relate to her having weaknesses, and these sort of more, just outright strong, like no weaknesses to be found characters I couldn't really relate to. And so I liked having a character like that. But I think with Annie, it was difficult for me. Honestly, she was harder to write than Lee. I had sort of grown up reading so many books that starred boys that in my head, when I started writing Fireborn, like Lee was very much the main character. And it was actually only in the editorial process, I had an editor who I think knew exactly what she was doing. And she sort of would push me to make Annie a bit more of a main character and to sort of think of her as having like protagonist potential, basically. So a lot of realizations Annie makes about her own inhibitions in Fireborn and sort of like her internalized like misogyny or sort of classism against her own class, these are sort of realizations I was sort of making at the same time about her and about writing female characters and about myself, I suppose, by extension. And I don't know, it was fun sort of like finally pushing her onto the main stage and realizing she deserved to be there, and like then writing that realization into her. And then in Flamefall, yeah, it was interesting. I kind of wanted to look at the other side of leadership for women, and also just like, I guess, privilege as a scholarship kid, because I feel like I was a scholarship kid when I was in high school. I went to a boarding school and I was on a scholarship there, and so I was able to kind of really always would tap into that, writing about Annie sort of feeling like an outsider in these privileged situations. But I also wanted to kind of examine the way you like fail to realize that you are privileged too when you're a scholarship kid. So, she really embraces this meritocratic system, even when its like failings are kind of staring her in the face, because it served her well, it got her to where she is. So I wanted to kind of have her confront that kind of willful complacency. And at the same time, like even as she's realizing she has these weaknesses, I did want to sort of look at the way, like the sort of particular nastiness that people can reserve for women leaders. Like towards the end of Flamefall, you see more of that. I was writing it like not long after, I think, the 2016 elections. It was all in the mind about like kind of the way we evaluate women leaders specifically. So that all went into Annie and Flamefall.
Yeah, I love what you said about realizing that internal misogyny in yourself and writing that realization into Annie, because those moments do feel so honest as like a woman in society, where you realize that stuff and you're like, why am I rooting for the man? Like this guy is competing against me, and yet somehow I'm rooting for him, or I think he's better. And it's because of what we've all learned and what she's learned and how she has to navigate around that. And yeah, I loved in this book too her realization that just because a system has worked for her does not mean the system works. And how do you fight that, or how do you change that when you're in it? Another character who sort of connected to Annie, who I absolutely love, even though I never agree with him, is the character of Power, who I would say he's like one of those villains that you love, but I don't even think villain is like a fair word for him. He's not, it's like too black and white. It's too like, he's not evil. He's like a very self-interested character. Like he really does go for what he thinks, and he has his own backstory and trauma and issues that he's dealing with, and how he presents to the world sort of corresponds to that. But my favorite thing about him is you never, like, you keep thinking that he's had his turn moment and he's like an ally now and things are going to be good, and then he does something and you're like, no, why? What'd you do? And so I just wanted you to talk about creating and plotting a course for a character like that, where you constantly never know what he's going to do next.
Power's a funny one, because I was talking about him with a young reader recently, and she talked about how she felt like he had layers, and I felt like that was a really good way of putting it, because quite literally his personality came about in layers in the drafts. So originally he was just kind of a nasty guy, like very irredeemable, a little bit menacing to the girls, to Annie and Krista. And my editors kept on saying, I think you want to make him viable. And she meant like romantically viable with Annie. And I was like, I don't know, like what? But it became this sort of litmus test for his character complexity, like at the point where somebody's romantically viable, that makes them like an interesting kind of antagonist in a way that he just wasn't originally. And also makes him more than just an antagonist, which I think is a nice place to have a character. And so all of the sort of sequences where they ally with each other and they train together in Fireborn were like added in later as I was trying to make Power viable. And actually the whole idea of them training and her learning how to do spillovers came about because my editor was like just joking around, and she was like, well, how about they play spillover together in the stables? And I was like, actually that's a pretty good idea. And so that was how that happened. And yeah, I think what you say about you never know what he's gonna do. I feel like I've had these friends, especially when I was in school, like high school and college, where I think the line in Flameball is like, it's like he's not necessarily a good person, but she generally trusts him to be good to her. And I feel like there are these people that you sort of form very close relationships with, often boys and often like teetering on the edge of a romantic sort of situation where you're like, I don't think this is a good person. Like I think I've always been drawn to people who I'm like, is this person a psychopath? Like I don't know, but but I enjoy talking to them, and they're a good companion, like comrade in some way. But you never do know what they're gonna do. And often I've found those kinds of relationships can be very like intimate and like can end very badly. And so I kind of wanted to explore all of that like strange emotional territory with Annie and Lee in Flamefall.
Yeah, and I like what you said sort of about whether he could be a romantic viable option. I like that that's not the assumption. It's not like this is a weird triangle situation.
Right.
I think there's all of your characters have this humanity, but none of them have that like it's okay because they're the good guy. So like their poor choices, or in his case, like he says some very not okay things, many moments of that. We never are like, it's fine because he is going to fall in love with her or anything like that. Like there are clear distinctions of this is not okay behavior, but he's a person and he's a fully formed person, and we're going to see what he does next.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
right.
absolutely.
I mean, because I think in real life, you're not going around like labeling people villain. Like there are people you're sort of coexisting with, especially I think in college or in school settings where you're like thrown up with just whoever is in your dorm. Where you're like, oh, I don't know about this guy, but like also you could have a good friendship with them sometimes. Like I don't know. It's all very nebulous and hard to define.
Absolutely. And then you add in the like military element of what these kids are going through, and it's like he's good at what he does, and unfortunately that plays a part in it as well.
Yeah.
The other character I really wanted to talk about was the new point of view character of Griff. So as you mentioned in Fireborn, we got Lee and Annie's point of view, and then in Flamefall you've added Griff. I love the addition of his voice in this book, mainly because it really like recenters the stakes of everything. I feel like to some extent with Lee and Annie, a lot of what they're talking about is a little more theoretical or a little more like touching on people outside in the immediate future of what's happening. Whereas with Griff, he is really truly fighting for survival. He is fighting to protect his family. He is fighting to literally stay alive. I was wondering if the addition of his character was something you knew from the beginning, or if it was something that you added in as you were writing Flamefall, and sort of where he came from in the process of the story.
Sure. Yeah, I think so the plot line of Dilo and Griff had been around for a long time. Like, but the thing that I wasn't really expecting or wasn't planning was when I sat down to write Flamefall. I was planning to have actually that third POV be from Dila's perspective, from the perspective of the aristocrat. And instead, and it was the same scene. I went in writing the same scene for the opening chapter where it's like Dila and Griff. So it's like a dragon lord and his like squire who also rides a dragon, and they're meeting before the triarchy, like in a court sort of situation. And I always pictured it being from Dila's perspective. I started writing it. It felt very flat. And then sort of on a lark, I was like, let's try writing from Griff's perspective. And I didn't have a great sense of, in my head, I thought Griff would be sort of like downtrodden and sad because he's like oppressed. And then I started writing it and he just was like very snarky. And it was quite fun. I think it was like this like backlash of sort of personality after writing Lee and Annie, who are very sort of repressed and respectful. And so having this new character sort of come on who just sort of took over the scene in a way that like I wasn't expecting. And I don't usually talk that way about characters. Like, I don't know, I know some authors like to talk about the characters as if they sort of have minds of their own, but I really don't usually think of it that way. But this was the one situation where I was like, I really didn't expect the scene to go the way it ended up just sort of pouring out. And Griff's voice always remained clear like that. Sort of like he just sort of marched into the story and took over, which felt very in character for him, really. And I think it is exactly what you say. Like, it's very helpful to remember, like, what are we fighting for? Because Annie and Lee can sort of get lost in these theoretical weeds of like, what's the lesser of two evils, which is not a super inspiring or compelling problem, and you want to kind of remember, no, the worst evil is very bad.
No, that's so interesting and amazing, and I love that he kind of like appeared on the scene and was like, this is the story I'm telling, because it feels
Right.
very much like that. Like, he, as you said, Griff is what is called a humble born writer. So in this other society you've introduced us to, he is not of the aristocratic line, but they needed more people to ride dragons, so they allowed the serfs and the peasants of this land to present themselves to the dragons, and some of them were chosen. And then he is very much repressed by this aristocratic group of people who have come in and sort of taken over his home. So in a lot of ways, he has a very rough situation, but he does have this like fire to him where he's like constantly pushing back and constantly finding whatever avenue he can to make whatever he's trying to do work. And I love that about them. And I love that that's like his voice. I'm here, because it feels very much like that in the story. And this is perfect because I actually wanted to go into talking a bit more about this new world of New Pythos. In Fireborn, they were very much like the other. We didn't know how real they were, and then they were real, but we just kind of knew they were there. We weren't really sure exactly what was going on. They were sort of this unseen enemy. And now in this book, we have a character who lives there, who is in it every day, and we see the full effect of what has happened to this aristocratic group of families who have been kicked out of their original home and have taken over this new one. And I thought interweaving their story with Callipolis's story and that of Lee and Annie and their friends, it makes it a lot more difficult to know exactly who you're rooting for, because there are moments where Griff and Lee and Annie are enemies, but you don't want anything bad to happen to any of them. Yeah. And like you said, like the true evil, or like the worst evil in the book, is at times tied up in other elements that make it really hard to know which way you want things to go. And you've also sort of introduced us to this great new cast of characters. I was wondering where you sort of pulled the inspiration for creating that new community and that new society that we're more fully thrown into in this book.
Sure. Yeah, I'm trying to think. New Pythos, I always wanted it to be like kind of a feudal, aristocratic Callipolis. If you rewound Callipolis to before the revolution, kind of a glimpse of what that was like. So sort of one city as a foil to the other. That was kind of a part of the plan from the beginning. I think for exactly the reason that you say, that that way you can sort of show this complexity of like, you can have these political movements that are pushing for some sort of larger justice, but within both sides there's going to be personal tragedy. And so I wanted to have that sort of mapped out on both sides, even though change needs to happen. As far as the actual cultural sort of like touchstones of New Pythos, I ended up sort of the easiest way to like think about it for me was if a sort of Ireland to Britain analog. So if Ireland had been at a certain point taken over by the Romans as Britain was. So the idea is like the Aurelians occupying New Pythos are sort of these former conquerors who came a long time ago, as they did in Callipolis and the mainland, and they sort of are still there. But there's these lingering sort of ethnic, cultural ties that you see with the local native population of the island to the mainland of Callipoli is a similar language, not the same language. And actually, we cast an Irish voice actor for Griff, which I'm really excited about. I think he'll do great. And then the sort of idea of the exiled royals in New Pythos was loosely, I sort of borrowed imagery and symbolism from the Jacobites and sort of went down a rabbit hole looking at all the different things that they would use to symbolize the king across the water. I thought that was really interesting. So those were kind of big inspirations. And then I just really, really like tall rocks, like karst. I went to see, back in the days when we traveled, I spent some time at Megara Meteora in Greece, and the karst formations down by Guilin in southern China. And so I just loved these like tall, like strange rock formations. And so that sort of love made its way into this story. First, it's just a setting, and then it became a part of sort of the cultural values and touch points of the native population in New Pythos.
Absolutely. And I loved that they had their own culture. And I also loved how, to some extent, the conquering kings, like you said, there really wasn't, they didn't learn anything. Like, I loved the truth of that in those moments too, that they did not, they like had this horrible bloody revolution happen to them, and they weren't like, let's try to do better. They were like, let's just keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really an interesting continuation of that story. And I can't wait I'm so excited to see what happens next with those guys, because that side is a lot easier to know exactly kind of who you're rooting for, I think.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to have somewhere where you're like, okay.
Yeah, it's helpful to have one villain where you're like, no, he's just bad. Like, there's no redeeming quality. He's just evil.
Yeah, I have been finding writing book 3 that it's all just it's more streamlined. Like, there's sort of a more straight sense of who are the villains, which I like. I feel like coming out of Flamefall, it was all very gray, and now it's like a little more black and white, which is a fun change.
We've got a lot more to talk about with Rosaria, and we'll continue to chat with her right after this break. I love that your books don't have, like we were saying, like there is kind of, with New Pythos, there is sort of a villain that is pretty clear, but especially in Lee and Annie's story, it's a lot more difficult to determine who to root for. It's like, everybody's got a point, but everyone's got problems too. And I love that the answers aren't simple, because I don't think in life these answers are simple. I think they're really complicated questions. I think you've sort of beautifully captured that human truth. It's almost never a question of right and wrong. It's more like picking which of really terrible options is like the least awful, like which one's going to end with the least people dying horribly. And so I was wondering, do you ever find yourself rooting for a side, or like hoping that one side does better than maybe you've planned for it to, or it's going to?
I mean, no, not like intellectually. I think in terms of sort of my disposition and personality, I definitely, Annie's take on things always resonates on a gut level, because I think I tend to be kind of like a grumpier, pragmatic person, and I have a hard time like feeling Lee's idealism. Like I just don't have it in me, but I sort of understand the value of both sides and the flaws, like on an intellectual level. So sometimes a big thing that helps me is just seeing how beta readers respond, and specifically beta readers with personalities different from my own, to make sure that I'm sort of giving everything its due perspective, and kind of just remembering elements that I wouldn't naturally think of. One of the things that I've been pleased with seeing early reactions from Flamefall is like some people have been reading it and telling me like, oh, I couldn't stand Annie. Like, I was rooting for Lee the whole time. And I'm like, that's perfect, because that means I did my job right as far as I could.
I definitely had it was the thing of like, one chapter I'd definitely be rooting for Lee, and the next chapter I'd be like, no, why did you do that? Like, you ruined it. Now Annie's right. What the heck? It's so complicated. And I think what you've done really well too is the truth of revolution tends to breed more revolution. And the more you tell people that you're going to make things better, the more they expect you to try to make things better. And what does that actually mean? And what does that actually look like? Along with the new characters that you've introduced in this sort of other society, you've also introduced some new characters in Callipolis who are sort of antagonist to the Guardians. How did they come up in the story and creating that side plot as well?
Yeah, there's a new character named Megara who is sort of a leader of a protest group, and Lee falls in with her. And I really wanted her to be the YA heroine that Annie isn't. You know, she's leading a revolution and she's gonna like bring justice to the people, you know, sort of a Triss, a Katniss, and Annie just like can't stand this girl. I just found it kind of funny to have this sort of YA plot going on that was like not the main plot. I mean, obviously the main plot's also YA because it's a YA book, but just that sort of like revolutionary plot. I think that was where I struggled the most because I think then I would be like, oh, but look at these ways that Megara sort of fails to look at sort of the practical implications of what she's doing. But the important thing was to go back and say, well, look at the ways that Annie sort of fails to see the value in what Megara is pushing for. So sort of it took, again, layers, just going back and making sure everything had that full perspective.
Yeah, they're kind of great foils to each other because they both, at the heart of what they both want things to be better for the same people, but they're going about it very, very differently. And I like what you said, too, about how she definitely is a little bit more like what you'd maybe expect from a YA heroine. But because she's not like the POV character, you can see like there are problems with that, too. Like she's got her own set of issues she's got to figure out. And I also just appreciate in any YA book where the people who are children, you still get the sense that everybody in these stories is a kid and they're figuring it out. They really are 16, 17. They're not like 30-year-olds in a 16-year-old body where you're like, you're not really, that's not believable. It's like they're still making the same mistakes that you would expect people who are that age to make. And I think going along with that, I did want to touch on, I love that romance isn't like, it's there in your books, but it's not like it's not like, will they, won't they, is the big question. There's like a lot of other stuff going on that these people have to worry about. But like, it doesn't mean they can't also have romance in their lives.
Sure.
The one I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think you mentioned it before. We also have this new romance that kind of blossoms that I really love because, as you were saying, it has this echo of the power dynamic between Lee and Annie, but it's more solidified. Like, it's kind of what might have happened between Lee and Annie if the revolution hadn't have happened and he had stayed this highborn aristocrat and she had stayed the serf that family she had been born into. So I was wondering if you could talk about developing that relationship between Griff and Delio and sort of those parallels between the two different worlds that these guys are living in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think if I could put a conscious like point on it, it was probably that I wanted to sort of look at similar power dynamics, but then invert them in small ways. So with Annie and Lee, I think there is sort of this residual, like the way the power is imbalance is stacked is very sort of along traditional lines, both in terms of gender and class, because he's older and he's a boy and he comes from a higher class. So it's like in every possible way, there is still this sense of her having like a lower footing in their relationship when it starts. And then I wanted to sort of look at that and sort of like skew some of those variables with Griff. So like you have him originally in this relationship with Julia where she's really the one in power and she's abusing her power, and it's sort of like traditional gender dynamics damned. Like he's definitely the disadvantaged person in that relationship. And then going from there to Delio, technically Delio has more power, but because their relationship doesn't really start until Delio like recognizes Griff's autonomy and sort of grants him dignity to sort of choose his own path, I think their relationship comes from a place of respect, a lot like Annie and Lee. Furthermore, like I think there's this element with Griff because he's such a good, strong writer. Like he sort of wears the pants in their relationship, even though he comes from a lower class. So I thought that was just really interesting to kind of divorce these elements and look at how you could sort of reassemble them with different people, different personalities.
No, absolutely. I agree with Annie and Lee. It's sort of this strange dynamic. They were always sort of competing for top rider, and they were now in this world where in theory they were equal, but there were these like echoes of things that they couldn't shake or couldn't get rid of. Whereas with Griff and Delio, Griff is a better rider, but does not have the social power in the situation. And what does that mean in this world? I really enjoyed also the sort of again, making it really difficult to know who to root for, the complication of the fact that, like we were saying, there is sort of this greater evil in the book, and this sort of like, these are the guys who are definitely we're not rooting for them. And Delio's really strongly connected to them. That is his family. That is the side he's fighting for. And so makes this question of what can Griff do even more complicated, because sort of going against someone that he cares a lot about and wants to, in theory, maybe protect, but goes against protecting himself and the other people that he cares about. And I thought that was such an interesting dynamic to explore.
Right. I mean, Delio's much further along the path of being sort of complicit in his own family's corruption than Lee was. Like, he sort of got off easy in a way because he got out when he was younger. It's a different starting point for sure.
I love that with Lee too. I feel like we haven't talked about him much, but he does have such a journey, and he's like the main character, but it's fine. He does have such a journey in the first book about saying no to his family in order to choose what he thinks is right, and then sort of has these like double great betrayals where he betrays his family and chooses the guardians and his friends, and then comes back to find out that the people he just tried to fight for maybe aren't on his side as much. And then in this book, he's trying to stand by the decisions that he made and the people he wants to protect and what that means. And I do love Lee as much as everyone else. I think he's a great character, and I'm very excited to see what he does next. Some of his decisions in this book, I was like, no, you're so close. You're almost there.
I know.
It's like a very 17-year-old boy problem of like,
right.
So
exactly.
darn close.
It's funny. One of the things that I hear about the most from the first book is, I think, his most sort of 17-year-old boy moment where he, goes off with some other girl because he can't get the one he wants. And like, so many readers are so upset by this, very, very upset by it. I think it's very funny. Occasionally you'll have somebody say like, oh, I liked that because it felt like a teenager. But I think teenagers are like, no, that wasn't good. It's a great I don't know, Rorschach test of what people look for in characters.
There is definitely a strong desire as you're reading it. I love, because there's always that thing in books where there are two characters where you're like, I know they're supposed to be together. Like, they clearly have feelings for each other, and it clearly would be great, but they're being kept apart. And I think sometimes that can feel arbitrary, like trying to extend the storyline. But I love that in your book it doesn't. It's like, no, there are actual real problems they have to solve, and they're actually on different sides of a lot of issues. And they've got to figure it out. But yes, I do think there are definitely a couple moments where you're like, Lee, come on, just get it together.
It's been fun writing book 3 because I feel like he kind of gets it together. So it's like,
yay! Annie deserves it. she's put up with a lot of his nonsense.
Right.
It's crazy. And I love that he still doesn't lose, though. I think there were a couple moments in this book that I just really appreciated where he still doesn't lose that feeling of like, you can never completely get away from the trauma of his past and the beginning of his life. And he has these moments where he realizes that things feel reminiscent of that, and how does he deal, or how does he like find some source of being okay, and how does Annie kind of contribute to that? It all feels so much more sort of complicated in like a great way, which I love, than just like two people being kept apart for like no particular reason other than like it's not time yet. But
well, it's funny. I always feel like it would make sense for them like never to end up together because they do have this pretty twisted past. It's funny when people sense emotions. I think they think, okay, that means that it's an OTP, like they have to get together. So, which is not to say, sorry, I don't mean to say anything either way that's spoilery about book 3. It's also, I find it very important to portray characters who maybe they had trauma that they're sort of still recovering from in many ways, that they'll never entirely be recovered from, but that they don't really let define them. So I like sort of having that element of strength in both Annie and Lee.
Absolutely. There's never sort of that moment where they're, because I don't think that's true, that we never have a moment where we're like, and I'm good, like, and everything's fine, and it's all in the past. It's still a part of who they are and has shaped them into who they are. But how do you move forward, and how do you figure out what comes next? So actually, the last thing I wanted to touch on, I love that your story really is about what comes after revolution. I feel like a lot of times YA are really focused on the revolution, and then it's kind of like, and then we made a better society and it was all good. Whereas your story really is like, no, the revolution's already happened. Like, this is what comes next. This is what building the new society looks like. And in Flamefall, we really get to see these sort of young characters have to deal with the question of, how do you create change that brings about something better rather than just a change of power or an exchange of the keys? I feel like that's a question that readers can really take into the real world of, yes, we can all agree that something isn't right or that something needs to change, but how do we practically make it better? And I was wondering if there's anything you hope that readers can take away from your books and from your stories.
I always hesitate on these questions because I always feel like, you want the work to kind of speak for itself. And I think it says different things to different people as the goal, I think, for me. But I guess if I had to say one thing that I would observe that I think is important, that I hope readers would notice, is that I think Annie and Lee both kind of learn in Flamefall, especially, that like perfection is the enemy of the good, right? Like, they have to learn to compromise, and that's when things start really happening in their city for the better, is when they both figure out how to compromise. I think these days there's like a lot of talk. People are like, I'm done compromising. That's kind of the energy you hear from across the political spectrum. Thinking about all this, observing everything as political theory major, that's worrying. It's the sign of like a breakdown of the institution itself almost, and it doesn't lead to progress as much as deadlock. And so when I'm thinking about these things, I just hope the idea of compromise becomes something we celebrate again.
And I think that is definitely a message very front and center in Flamefall. I like what you said, that sort of everyone gets different things out of books. Sort of along with that too, what your book does really well is this idea of, there are these people who you are like, that is wrong on a moral level. Like the new Pythos aristocrats, it's not okay what they're doing to people. That we can all agree is wrong. Yeah. But these other questions that are coming up do require some kind of compromise and do require some kind of working together, figuring out what the better solution is. And those two things can exist at the same time, and you can be fighting those wars on different fronts. And I really like in this book that you brought in the question too of trusting your instincts. I think especially with Annie and trusting when something doesn't feel right, maybe you should examine why that is, and not just trust what's come before, but figure out what comes next. And I loved those moments with her. Again, I just love Annie. I think she's great.
I'm glad. That makes me so happy.
Yeah, but I love that message in there. So where can our listeners learn more about you and your books?
They can find me on my website, rosariamunda.com, or on social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, more on Instagram. My handle for both is Rosaria Munda.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It was so nice to talk to you about Flamefall, which, again, comes out March 23rd.
Thank you, Chelsea. It was so much fun.
Absolutely. And thanks all of you for listening. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. We're at BookmarkedYA. You can also follow Bookstacked on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you like the show, don't forget to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast. And you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at PluckyBookmark. I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.